The 19th of September, 1944. The morning fog is just lifting over the fields near Arracourt, France. Inside the cramped, grease-stained turret of an M4 Sherman, Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson is waiting to die. He knows the statistics. Hiding in the tree line is a German Panzer V Panther. It possesses 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor and a high-velocity 75 millimeters KK-42 cannon that can punch through a Sherman like paper at 1,000 yards. Thompson's crew is effectively blind. His gunner, Sergeant Crawford, is hunched over the M70 telescopic sight, staring through a narrow soda straw view of the world. He cannot see the flanks. He cannot see the rear. This is the mathematics of death in the Lorraine Campaign. If the tank commander spots the ambush, he must scream the target. That takes 1 second. The hydraulic traverse motor must whine into action to rotate the turret. That takes 2 seconds. That is a 3-second delay. The German crew, sitting in ambush, needs only 2 seconds to fire. Do the math. You are a burning wreck 1 full second before your gunner even sees the enemy. But Frank Thompson, a former steel mill worker, decided to cheat the math. To understand how he survived the impossible, we have to go back to a stolen piece of glass and a violation of Army regulations. That violation wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of desperate necessity born from a design flaw that was turning the M4 Sherman into a steel coffin. To the generals in the Pentagon, the Sherman was a masterpiece of logistics and reliability. It ran on a Cadillac engine, it was easy to repair, and we could ship thousands of them across the Atlantic. But to Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson, sitting in the loader's hatch, the Sherman had a defect so glaring it was criminal. It was functionally blind. You have to understand the architecture of a 1,944 tank engagement. It is not a duel. It is a game of hide and seek played with high explosives. The winner is invariably the crew that shoots first. And to shoot first, you must see first. This is where American engineering failed the men of the 4th Armored Division. Consider the workspace of the gunner, Sergeant William Crawford. In battle, Crawford is hunched forward, his face pressed against the rubber eye cup of the M70 telescopic sight. This optic offered excellent magnification for placing a shell into a bunker at 800 yards, but it came with a terrible price: tunnel vision. The field of view was barely 12 degrees. Imagine driving your car down a highway at 30 miles per hour, but you are only allowed to look through a cardboard paper towel tube taped to the center of your windshield. You can see what is directly ahead of you with perfect clarity, but you are utterly blind to the cyclist on your right or the truck merging from your left. To the gunner's right sits the tank commander. His job is to be the eyes of the beast. He stands on a platform, head swiveled, looking through a periscope that rotates 360 degrees, or, if he is brave and foolish, popping his head out of the hatch. The Army Field Manual, FM 17-12, was very clear on how this relationship worked. The commander scans the horizon. The commander spots the target. The commander verbally directs the gunner onto the target. It sounds efficient on paper. In the chaos of the Lorraine Campaign, it was a death sentence. Thompson had watched this by-the-book system fail 2 weeks earlier, on September 7th. His previous loader, Corporal David Kozlowski, a steelworker from Chicago, was sitting exactly where Thompson sat now. They were advancing near a tree line. A German Panther was waiting, engine off, silent, camouflaged in the shadows. The Panther commander was watching the Sherman through high-quality Zeiss optics. He didn't need to communicate with a loud intercom. His gunner was already looking at the same sector. Inside the Sherman, the American commander was scanning the 12 o'clock position, searching the road ahead. The gunner, Crawford, was looking through his straw, also focused forward. The Panther was at their 2 o'clock, flanking them. The physics of the delay were brutal. The American commander eventually saw the glint of the Panther's muzzle. He keyed his throat microphone. Gunner, traverse, right, 2 o'clock, tank. That took 1.5 seconds. Crawford heard the command through the static-filled intercom. He had to mentally process the direction right, squeeze the hydraulic traverse grip, and wait for the turret motor to whine into life and rotate the massive steel housing. That took 2 seconds. Then Crawford had to look through his narrow sight, scanning the blurry tree line to find the specific shape of the enemy tank amidst the foliage. That took another 1.5 seconds. 5 seconds total. In tank combat, 5 seconds is an eternity. The German Panther fired at second number 2. The high-velocity shell slammed into the turret side before Crawford had even stopped traversing. The interior of the Sherman turned into a blast furnace of spalling metal and burning propellant. Kozlowski died instantly. Thompson wasn't just grieving, he was analyzing. He realized that the problem wasn't the German gun. The problem was the American lag. The neural pathway between the commander's eyes and the gunner's trigger finger was too long. The commander was overloaded, trying to watch the front, the flanks, and the map, all while managing the driver. Meanwhile, the gunner sat there with his lethal 75mm cannon, staring uselessly at a patch of empty dirt, waiting to be told what to kill. The injustice of it gnawed at Thompson. The Sherman actually had plenty of optics. The driver had periscopes. The assistant driver had periscopes. Even Thompson, the loader, had a dedicated M6 periscope in his hatch roof that could rotate 360 degrees. Thompson could spin his periscope and see the flank. He could see the blind six, the rear of the tank. He could see the threats that Crawford was missing. But Thompson was just the loader. His job was to shove shells into the breach, not to aim. He had the eyes, but he had no way to transfer that visual data to the gunner. There was no electronic data link, no digital HUD, just a loud, vibrating steel box filled with 5 shouting men. The Army's solution to this problem was better training. They told commanders to scan faster. They told gunners to listen harder. It was the classic bureaucratic response. Blame the operator for the machine's deficiency. But Frank Thompson knew that no amount of training could overcome the speed of a high-velocity anti-tank round. As long as the gunner had to wait for the commander to tell him where to look, they would always be second. And in the hedgerows of France, second place didn't mean losing. It meant burning. Thompson looked at the interior of the turret. He looked at his own periscope, catching the light from the rear of the tank. Then he looked at the back of Crawford's head, buried in that telescopic sight. There had to be a way to bridge that gap. There had to be a way to give Crawford eyes in the back of his head without waiting for an order. The answer wasn't in the supply depot, and it certainly wasn't in the field manual. It was in his shaving kit. Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson pulled the standard-issue steel mirror from his kit. It was a cheap, rectangular piece of polished metal, 3 inches by 4, intended for shaving in a foxhole. It cost the Army maybe 50 cents. But in the dim red light of the turret interior, Thompson wasn't looking at a grooming tool. He was looking at a geometric solution to a tactical stalemate. Thompson wasn't an engineer with a degree from MIT. He was a mill worker from Pennsylvania. He spent his civilian life fixing machinery that refused to work, often with nothing more than baling wire and stubbornness. He didn't see the Sherman tank as a sacred piece of government property. He saw it as a flawed machine that needed a patch. His eyes darted from the mirror to the loader's M6 periscope mounted in the roof of the turret, just above his own station. That periscope was the key. Unlike the gunner's fixed telescope, the loader's periscope was fully rotatable. Thompson could spin it 360 degrees to check the rear or the flanks for infantry. The problem was that only he could see through it. To transfer that information to Crawford, he had to use the slow, unreliable voice intercom. Thompson held the mirror up against the steel mesh of the turret basket, positioning it just to the left of Crawford's head. He tilted it, adjusting the angle, playing with the reflection lines. And there it was, the geometry of survival. If he mounted the mirror at exactly a 45-degree angle on the turret wall, it wouldn't reflect the interior of the tank. It would catch the reflection of the prism from his own overhead periscope. It acted as a visual relay. If Thompson rotated his periscope to look backward, the deadly blind six, the image would travel down from the roof, hit the shaving mirror, and appear right in Crawford's peripheral vision. It was, in essence, a crude analog heads-up display. It meant that while Crawford was staring forward through his gun sight, his left eye could monitor the rear of the tank simply by glancing at the mirror. No shouting, no delay. If Thompson saw a Panther flanking them, Crawford would see it too, instantly. But drilling holes into a 30-ton war machine wasn't like fixing a tractor. It was a direct violation of Army Regulation 850-15, unauthorized modification of ordnance. To the U.S. Army, the Sherman tank was a standardized weapon system. Modifications had to be approved by the Ordnance Department, tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground, and issued via official technical bulletins. Drilling unapproved holes into the turret basket was technically destruction of government property. The punishment could range from a reduction in rank to a full court-martial. Thompson sat in the cold steel belly of the tank and weighed the options. On one side of the scale, a dishonorable discharge and a military prison cell. On the other side, burning to death because a German gunner saw them 2 seconds faster. It wasn't a hard choice. At 0200 hours, while the rest of the battalion slept or played cards in the bivouac, Thompson went to work. He didn't have precision machine tools. He had a hand drill, a pair of wire cutters, and a spool of baling wire scavenged from a farm fence. The sound of the drill biting into the steel mounting bracket seemed deafening in the quiet night, a screech of metal on metal that threatened to wake every officer in the motor pool. Thompson paused every few seconds, sweat stinging his eyes, listening for the crunch of boots on gravel. If an officer walked in now, there would be no explaining the physics of light reflection. He would just be a sergeant caught sabotaging his own vehicle. He worked quickly, his hands moving with the practiced dexterity of a mechanic. He drilled 2 small pilot holes into the mild steel of the turret cage. He stripped the wire, threading it through the holes and around the corners of the shaving mirror. He twisted the wire tight with his pliers, securing the glass firmly against the vibration of the tank's engine. Then came the calibration. Thompson sat in the loader's seat and rotated his periscope to face the rear of the tank. Then he slid over to the gunner's seat, Crawford's seat. He pressed his face against the telescope, simulating the combat posture. He looked forward, then flicked his eyes left. There, in the dirty rectangle of the shaving mirror, was a crystal-clear view of the tank's rear deck. He rotated the periscope again. The view in the mirror shifted, panning across the left flank. It worked. He had successfully bypassed the entire chain of command. He had short-circuited the OODA Loop: observe, orient, decide, act. By eliminating the command phase, he had merged the loader's eyes with the gunner's trigger. Thompson wiped the metal shavings from the floor, hid his tools, and climbed out into the cool French air. The tank looked exactly the same from the outside, just another olive-drab Sherman in a line of hundreds. But inside, it was now the most advanced fighting vehicle in the Third Army. It possessed a capability that even the terrifying German Panthers lacked: a shared consciousness. The next morning, Sergeant Crawford climbed into the turret and froze. He stared at the crude assembly of wire and glass bolted next to his head. He looked at Thompson, eyebrows raised, a silent question hanging in the air. "Don't ask," Thompson muttered, shoving a 75mm shell into the ready rack. "Just keep your left eye open." Crawford didn't argue. He adjusted the mirror, saw the view behind him, and a slow realization dawned on his face. He didn't see a shaving mirror. He saw a lifeline. But the real test wasn't in the motor pool. The real test was waiting in the fog near Arracourt, where the theoretical physics of a shaving mirror would collide with the high explosive reality of the 5th Panzer Army. That high explosive reality arrived with the dawn, accompanied by the coughing roar of radial engines and the smell of brewing coffee mixed with 100-octane gasoline. As the 4th Armored Division woke up, the motor pool at Arracourt became a hive of organized chaos. Fuel trucks maneuvered between the columns. Ammunition crates were cracked open with crowbars. Officers shouted orders over the din of idling motors. In the middle of this industrial symphony, Staff Sergeant Thompson stood by his Sherman, trying to look invisible. To the casual observer, his tank, Blockbuster, looked identical to the 18 other M4s in the company. It was painted the same olive drab, carried the same white star, and was coated in the same layer of Lorraine mud. But inside the turret, hidden from the clipboard-wielding logistics officers, was a crime against Army regulations. The first hurdle wasn't the Germans. It was his own tank commander, Sergeant Reynolds. Reynolds was a by-the-book NCO, the kind of man who memorized the field manual and believed that regulations were written in blood. When he climbed into the turret that morning and saw the wire-rigged contraption bolted to the basket, he didn't see a tactical innovation. He saw a court-martial offense. Reynolds ran a hand over the rough steel wire holding the mirror. "Thompson!" he barked, his voice cutting through the intercom static. "What in God's name is this? Did you turn my tank into a beauty parlor?" "It's a sight relay, Sergeant," Thompson said, keeping his voice flat, trying to sound technical rather than desperate. "It bounces the view from my periscope to Crawford's eyes. Lets him see the rear without you calling it." Reynolds stared at it. He looked at the crude drill holes, bright, fresh metal scarring the painted interior. This was the friction point where war is actually fought. In Washington and at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, tanks were treated as standardized industrial products. They were designed by engineers who used slide rules, tested in controlled environments, and stamped with approval numbers. Uniformity was the religion of the Ordnance Department. If a part wasn't in the table of organization and equipment, it didn't exist. By drilling those holes, Thompson hadn't just modified a machine. He had challenged the entire philosophy of the U.S. Army. He was effectively saying that a mill worker with a hand drill knew more about tank combat than the combined engineering might of the Chrysler Corporation and the War Department. "If the colonel sees this," Reynolds muttered, tracing the angle of the glass, "we're all going to be peeling potatoes in Leavenworth until 1950. You know that, right? If the colonel sees us burning because a Panther flanked us." Crawford interjected from the gunner's seat, adjusting the mirror's tilt. "He won't have anyone to court-martial." "Leave it, Sarge. It works." Reynolds paused. He looked at his crewmen who hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night for 3 weeks, men with grease under their fingernails and fear in their eyes. He looked at the mirror again. He didn't understand the optics, but he understood the desperation. "Fine," Reynolds grunted, dropping into his seat. "But if that thing rattles loose and jams the turret ring during a traverse, I'll kill you myself before the Germans get the chance." The rejection of the system wasn't just bureaucratic, it was psychological. As the column began to roll out, moving toward the aggressive probing lines of the 113th Panzer Brigade, the doubt began to creep in. It was one thing to test a mirror in a quiet parking lot at 2 a.m. It was another to trust your life to it when the air was thick with armor-piercing shells. The brilliance of the Thompson Mod was also its curse. It looked ridiculous. It looked like junk. In a world of heavy steel, precision machine gears, and high-velocity ballistics, a shaving mirror held up by baling wire felt fragile. It felt like bringing a toy to a gunfight. As Blockbuster rumbled forward, the suspension groaning over the rutted French farmland, the vibration threatened to shake the assembly apart. Thompson watched the mirror vibrating in its wire cage. If the angle shifted by even 3 degrees, the geometry would break. The heads-up display would show Crawford nothing but the ceiling of the turret or the side of a radio set. The fog was thickening again, reducing visibility to less than 200 yards. This was Panther weather. The German tanks, with their superior camouflage and ambush tactics, thrived in this gray soup. They could sit silent and still, their engines cold, waiting for the noisy, clanking American column to blunder into their sights. Thompson watched Crawford. The gunner was tense, his eyes glued to the main telescope, scanning the limited 12-degree slice of gray fog in front of him. But every few seconds, Thompson saw Crawford's head twitch. A quick glance to the left, checking the mirror. It was an unnatural motion. Military training builds muscle memory. For 2 years, Crawford had been trained to wait for orders. See nothing, do nothing. Now, he was trying to rewire his own brain in real time, trying to trust a piece of glass over the voice of his commander. The skepticism of the system, the engineers, the officers, the regulations weighed heavy in the turret. They said the Sherman was fine. They said the tactics were sound. They said the loader should load and the commander should lead. Thompson gripped the safety rail as the tank lurched over a ditch. He had bet everything on the idea that the system was wrong. But as the radio crackled with the first frantic reports of enemy contact, able to, contact front, taking fire, the time for theory was over. The mirror was no longer a debate. It was the only thing standing between them and the funeral pyre. That funeral pyre was almost ignited at 0843 hours. The fog that had blanketed the Lorraine countryside began to tear apart, revealing the rolling hills near Arracourt like a curtain rising on a slaughterhouse. Blockbuster was holding a hull-down position behind a low ridge. Inside the turret, the air was stale, smelling of cordite and unwashed bodies. Sergeant Reynolds, the commander, was standing on his seat, eyes glued to his periscope, scanning the tree line to the north, the 12 o'clock position where intelligence said the German thrust would come. "Keep scanning, Crawford," Reynolds hissed over the intercom. "Watch that road junction. If anything moves, put a hole in it." Crawford obediently kept his face pressed to the M70 telescope, traversing the gun slowly back and forth across the narrow sector of the road. He was doing exactly what he was trained to do, focusing 100% of his attention on the assigned kill zone. But the 113th Panzer Brigade wasn't using the road. 500 yards away, moving silently through a depression in the damp earth, a Panzer V Panther crept forward. It was hunting. Its wide tracks, designed for the Eastern Front, spread its 45 tons over the mud, allowing it to move with terrifying quiet. It wasn't approaching from the north. It was flanking from the southwest, the 8 o'clock. Thompson, sitting in the loader's hatch, was restless. He rotated his roof periscope, sweeping the left flank. Through the prism, the gray shapes of the field slid by. Bush, rock, fence post. Then, the shape moved. It was a geometric nightmare. The sharp, sloped angles of a Panther's hull, coated in Zimmerit anti-magnetic paste, emerging from the mist like a shark breaking surface. The German turret was already rotating. The long barrel of the 75mm KWK-42 was swinging toward them. In a standard engagement, this is the moment the math kills you. Thompson sees the tank. Thompson keys his mic. Thompson screams, "Tank left, 8 o'clock. Reynolds hears it. Reynolds looks. Reynolds verifies. Reynolds orders the traverse. 4 seconds. The German gunner was already settling his crosshairs. He needed maybe 2 seconds to fire. But Thompson didn't scream. He didn't have to. At the exact moment the Panther slid into Thompson's periscope view, a flash of motion erupted in the shaving mirror bolted to the turret wall. Crawford, whose right eye was buried in the main sights, saw the flicker in his left peripheral vision. It was an instinctive jolt, something large and moving in the blind six. His brain didn't process Panther. It processed threat. He didn't wait for Reynolds. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't check the azimuth. Crawford slammed his hand down on the hydraulic traverse control. "Traversing," Crawford shouted, his voice cracking. "Hold fire," Reynolds yelled, confused. "I didn't call a..." The turret motor screamed, a high-pitched hydraulic whine that drowned out the commander's confusion. The breech of the 75mm gun swept violently to the left, knocking Thompson back against the ready rack. The entire turret spun with a speed that felt reckless, blurring the interior details into a streak of white paint and green metal. Crawford wasn't looking through the telescope anymore. He was looking at the mirror, watching the reflection of the Panther center itself. As the image in the cracked glass aligned, he slammed his face back into the main gun sight. There it was, filling the optic. The Panther. The German gunner was fast, but he had hesitated. He had seen the Sherman's turret facing north and assumed he had the element of surprise. He took an extra half-second to refine his aim. He never got that half-second back. "On the way," Crawford screamed. His foot stomped the firing solenoid. The 75mm M3 gun roared. The recoil was violent, the breech block slamming back like a pile driver, ejecting a smoking brass casing that clattered onto the turret floor. The concussion sucked the air out of the compartment. Thompson was already moving before the brass hit the deck. He grabbed an M61 armor-piercing capped shell from the wet rack, flipped it, and shoved it into the smoking breech. "Up!" he screamed, slapping the breech block closed. Through the periscope, Thompson saw the result. The first round had struck the Panther low, shattering the drive sprocket and snapping the track. The German tank lurched violently to the right, its momentum spinning it sideways, exposing the thinner 45mm armor of its hull side. It was crippled, but its turret was still turning. The German gunner was trying to acquire the target that had just stung him. "Target! Tank! Fire!" Reynolds was screaming now, finally catching up to the reality of the battle his gunner was already fighting. Crawford didn't need the order. He had the crosshairs on the exposed flank. He fired again. The second round crossed the 500 yards in less than a second. It punched through the Panther's side armor just above the road wheels. The result was catastrophic. The ammunition stored in the German sponsons detonated. A pillar of white flame geysered out of the Panther's commander's hatch, followed instantly by the black, oily smoke of burning fuel. The German tank was dead. Inside Blockbuster, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the hum of the ventilator fans sucking the smoke out of the turret. Sergeant Reynolds stood frozen in the cupola. He looked at the burning wreck of the Panther, a machine that should have killed them. He looked at the smoking breech of his own gun, and then he looked at the shaving mirror, vibrating slightly on its baling wire mount. He realized what had just happened. Crawford hadn't engaged a target he could see. He had engaged a target he couldn't see. The loop had been closed. The delay had been erased. "How?" Reynolds started, his voice trembling slightly. "How did you spot him, Crawford?" "I was looking right at the road." Crawford leaned back from the sight, sweat streaking the grease on his face. He pointed a shaking finger at the mirror. "I saw him moving in the glass, Sarge. Thompson's rig. I saw him coming up the back door." Reynolds looked at Thompson. The loader was leaning against the ammo rack, knees shaking, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. He had risked a court-martial to drill those holes. He had risked his stripes to wire up a 50-cent piece of glass. That German had us dead to rights, Reynolds whispered. He had the drop on us. Not anymore, Thompson said, wiping the soot from his face. He had the gun. We had the eyes. The radio crackled to life again. Able 1, this is Able 6. Good shooting. Report status. Reynolds keyed the mic, his eyes still fixed on the mirror. Able 6. Target destroyed. 1 Panther. No damage to our unit. We are proceeding. He let go of the mic switch. He looked at Thompson with a new expression. It wasn't the look of a superior officer addressing a subordinate. It was the look of a man realizing he owed the loader his life. Thompson, Reynolds said, his voice firm, when we get back to the lager, I want you to install that rig on Hayes's tank. Tonight. The combat test was over. The theory was fact. The mirror hadn't just reflected light. It had reflected the future of armored warfare. But as the adrenaline faded, Thompson knew that winning one duel wasn't enough. The 4th Armored Division had hundreds of tanks, and every single one of them was just as blind as Blockbuster had been an hour ago. The contagion of innovation was about to spread. The contagion of innovation didn't wait for official orders. It spread through the 4th Armored Division like a fever. That night, under the cover of a blackout tarp draped over Sergeant Hayes's Sherman, Thompson became a teacher of heresy. He wasn't lecturing from a chalkboard. He was crouched in the grease-slicked basket of a tank, showing 3 other mechanics how to violate Army regulations with a hand drill. 45 degrees, Thompson whispered, guiding a mechanic's hand as he twisted the baling wire. If you mount it at 40 degrees, you see the radio rack. If you mount it at 50, you see the ceiling. It has to be 45 exactly to catch the prism. By dawn on September 20th, 6 tanks in Company A had the modification. By September 22nd, it was 14. The motor pool, usually a place of rigid adherence to the table of organization, had turned into a factory of unauthorized engineering. The supply sergeants began noticing a mysterious shortage of shaving mirrors. They didn't ask questions. They had heard the rumors from the front. The blind 6 was no longer blind. The effect on the battlefield was immediate and statistical. The Battle of Arracourt was grinding on, a swirling melee of maneuver warfare in the fog. The German 113th Panzer Brigade, desperate to retake the momentum, continued to rely on their superior optics to execute long-range ambushes and flanking hooks. They expected the Americans to be sluggish, reactive, and blind to the sides. But the Americans were changing. German after-action reports from the battle noted a disturbing trend. Panther crews attempting to slip around the American flanks were being engaged before they could settle into firing positions. American turrets were snapping onto targets with unnatural speed. The OODA Loop of the 4th Armored Division had tightened. The 3-second gap, the difference between life and death, had vanished. In the span of 4 days, the division destroyed 25 German tanks and assault guns for the loss of only 3 Shermans. It was a kill ratio that defied the technical specifications of the vehicles. The Sherman was still under-armored and under-gunned, but it was now fighting with a sensory advantage that no German engineer had accounted for. However, in the military, success does not excuse insubordination. The rumors of illegal modifications finally reached the ears of the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams was not a paper pusher. He was a warrior scholar of armored combat, a man who would later have the modern M1 main battle tank named after him. He didn't lead from a desk. He led from the turret of his own tank, Thunderbolt. He was aggressive, brilliant, and notoriously intolerant of incompetence. If he found his crews sabotaging their equipment with baling wire, there would be hell to pay. On the morning of September 26th, during a lull in the fighting, Abrams walked down the line of Company A. He climbed onto the rear deck of Thompson's tank. Thompson, who was refueling the engine, froze. This was it, the court-martial. Abrams dropped into the turret. He stood there for a long moment, chewing on his cigar, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He looked at the 75mm breech. He looked at the radio stack. And then his eyes landed on the crude, wire-wrapped mirror bolted to the basket wall. It looked trashy. It looked unprofessional. It looked like something a farmer would rig up to fix a broken tractor. "Sergeant!" Abrams shouted, his voice echoing in the steel box. Thompson scrambled up the hull and peered down through the hatch, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Sir," Abrams pointed a gloved finger at the mirror. Explain this. Now, Thompson swallowed hard. He didn't try to lie. He didn't try to blame Reynolds. It's a sight relay, Colonel. The gunner can't see the flank. I can see it with my periscope, but I can't aim the gun. The mirror bounces my view to him. It cuts the reaction time. Abrams stared at him. The cigar shifted to the other side of his mouth. Show me. Thompson dropped into the loader's seat. He rotated his periscope to the 6 o'clock position straight back. Abrams leaned into the gunner's seat, pressing his face against the main sight, then flicking his eyes to the mirror. He saw the view behind the tank perfectly. Abrams sat back. He was a man who understood the granular reality of tank warfare better than anyone in Europe. He knew that a tank commander was overburdened. He knew that split seconds killed men. He looked at the drill holes, the destruction of government property, and then he looked at the mirror again. He didn't see a violation. He saw the solution to a problem that had plagued the Shermans since 1942. How many tanks have this? Abrams asked, his voice quiet. 14, sir, Thompson admitted. We used every mirror we could find. Abrams climbed out of the turret and jumped down to the mud. He looked at Thompson, then at Reynolds, then at the rest of the crew who were standing at rigid attention, expecting the worst. You're out of uniform, Sergeant, Abrams said, pointing to Thompson's grease-stained coveralls. Yes, sir. And you're out of mirrors, Abrams continued. He turned to his executive officer, who was holding a clipboard. Major, get on the radio to supply. I want every shaving mirror in the Third Army requisitioned. I want them here by 1400 hours. He turned back to Thompson. You have until tomorrow morning to install this on every tank in the battalion. If you run out of wire, cut down a fence. If you run out of mirrors, steal them from the infantry. Is that clear? Yes, sir, Thompson shouted, the relief washing over him like cold water. And Sergeant, Abrams added, climbing onto his own jeep. Good work. The validation was absolute. Within a week, the Thompson Mod wasn't just a rogue experiment. It was standard operating procedure for the 37th Tank Battalion. It spread to the rest of the 4th Armored Division, and then, carried by word of mouth from mechanics transferring units, it jumped to the 6th Armored and the 10th Armored. The ripple effect was documented in the burning hulks of German armor littering the road to Germany. The Wehrmacht was no longer fighting a blind enemy. They were fighting a collective organism that saw in all directions at once. The desperate invention of a mill worker had become a force multiplier that no amount of Krupp steel could stop. But as the modification became standardized, a new threat emerged. It wasn't the Germans. It was the inevitable, crushing weight of the institution itself. The Army Ordnance Department eventually arrived to inspect the battlefield successes, and when they saw the mirrors, they didn't see Frank Thompson. They saw an engineering opportunity. The process of erasing the man to patent the machine had begun. The erasure began not with malice, but with a tape measure. In November 1944, a team from the Ordnance Department arrived at the 4th Armored Division's maintenance depot. These weren't the mud-caked men who fought in the turrets. They were engineers from Detroit and Aberdeen, men with clean fingernails and slide rules tucked into their breast pockets. They had heard reports of the division's anomalous kill ratios and came to investigate. When they inspected Blockbuster, they didn't see the genius of desperation. They saw a liability. One engineer, examining the baling wire brackets, noted in his log that the installation was crude, non-standard, and potentially hazardous to crew egress. They measured the angles. They calculated the lines of sight. They took photographs of the drill holes. And then, they did exactly what the industrial military machine always does. They gentrified the innovation. They took Thompson's concept, the geometry of the shared view, and drafted official blueprints. They replaced the scavenged shaving mirrors with factory-produced prismatic glass. They replaced the baling wire with welded steel brackets. They issued Technical Bulletin ORD 1945, authorizing the Field Expedient Vision device. Nowhere in that bulletin did the name Staff Sergeant Frank Thompson appear. The credit went to the collaborative efforts of the Ordnance Board. By January 1945, as the new M4A3 Shermans began rolling off the assembly lines in Detroit, they featured improved vision cupolas. The all-round vision cupola for the commander became standard. The concept of the gunner needing to see what the commander saw was baked into the design of the new T-26 Pershing tank. Thompson watched this happen from a distance. He didn't file a patent. He didn't write a letter to the War Department demanding recognition. He stood in the snow of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, loading shells into a breach that was now defended by the very system he had invented, content in the knowledge that the system worked. When the war ended in May 1945, the divergence between the man and the machine became absolute. The Sherman tanks were parked in massive depots, left to rust or be sold as scrap. The mirrors, the wires, the jagged drill holes, they were all melted down or forgotten. Frank Thompson turned in his uniform and took a train back to Pennsylvania. He walked back into the steel mill, punched his time card, and went back to fixing conveyor belts and blast furnace gears. He spent the next 30 years in the deafening roar of the mill, a ghost in his own life. His neighbors knew him as the quiet guy who was good with an engine. They didn't know that in the fall of 1944, he had effectively reprogrammed the tactical doctrine of the Third Army. But while Thompson faded, his idea did not. If you look at the evolution of armored warfare, you find the DNA of that shaving mirror in every modern main battle tank. Thompson had solved the fundamental problem of the hunter-killer dynamic. In a modern M1 Abrams tank, the commander has an independent thermal viewer, CITV. He scans for targets while the gunner engages the current threat. When the commander finds a new target, he presses a button on his joystick. The turret automatically slews to align the gunner's sight with the commander's view. It is a multi-million-dollar digital handshake. It allows the tank to engage multiple targets in seconds. It is the OODA Loop perfected. But strip away the thermal sensors, the laser rangefinders, and the stabilization computers, and what do you have? You have the exact same geometric principle that Frank Thompson rigged up with 50 cents of glass. The commander, loader spots the threat. The visual data is transferred instantly to the gunner. The gunner engages without verbal delay. Thompson didn't just invent a gadget. He invented the concept of the shared hunter-killer loop. He proved that a tank crew isn't 5 men doing 5 jobs. It is a single nervous system. If you sever the connection between the eyes and the hands, the organism dies. If you bridge that connection, whether with fiber optics or a shaving mirror, the organism survives. This is the deeper truth of the Thompson Mod. It reveals that the greatest weapon in the American arsenal wasn't the atomic bomb or the aircraft carrier. It was the terrifying ingenuity of the free-thinking soldier. The German army was superior in almost every technical metric. They had better steel, better optics, and better guns. But they were rigid. A German loader would never dare to drill a hole in his Panther without a written order from Berlin. He would follow the manual until the moment he died. Thompson looked at the manual, realized it was a suicide pact, and rewrote it with a hand drill. Frank Thompson died in 2003. There is no statue of him at Fort Knox. There is no Thompson sighting system in the manual. But his legacy isn't in bronze or ink. It is in the bloodline of William Crawford. Crawford survived the war. He went home to Detroit, married, and had 3 children. He had 7 grandchildren. Those generations exist because, for one split second in a foggy field in France, a piece of glass showed him a Panther before it could fire. That is the only patent that matters. The math of survival. But as we look back at the Shermans rusting in museums, it's easy to think that this kind of cowboy engineering ended in 1945. We assume that today, with our satellite uplinks and drone swarms, we have solved the fog of war. We haven't. The friction of combat is eternal. And somewhere, right now, in a desert or a jungle or a trench, there is another mechanic looking at a billion-dollar piece of equipment that doesn't quite work, holding a roll of duct tape, thinking, I can fix this. And just like Thompson, he probably won't ask for permission. To understand the full scope of this spirit, the rebellious drive to fix the unfixable, we have to look beyond the mud of France. Because while Thompson was hacking the ground war, thousands of miles away, in the skies over the Pacific, another American officer was looking at the P-38 Lightning and realizing that the official manual was going to get his pilots killed. That pilot was Major Charles Pappy Gunn, and his war against the laws of aerodynamics is a story even crazier than Thompson's mirror. But it proves the exact same truth. The manual is just a suggestion. History tends to remember the generals, Patton, Rommel, Eisenhower. It obsessively catalogs the machines, the Tiger, the Mustang, the Sherman, but it rarely remembers the glue that held them together, the unauthorized genius of the enlisted man. We study the armor thickness and the muzzle velocity, treating war like a top trumps card game. But we forget that the decisive factor is often a terrified 2-4-year-old with a hand drill and a refusal to accept the odds. Frank Thompson proved that you don't need a PhD or a Pentagon budget to change the course of a battle. You just need a problem that is killing your friends and the courage to ignore the rulebook long enough to fix it. His mirror didn't just reflect a German tank, it reflected the spirit that wins wars. It wasn't the steel of the Sherman that beat the Panther at Arracourt, it was the speed of the American mind. If you believe that these stories of battlefield ingenuity deserve to be rescued from the footnotes of history, you are in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are building a library of the forgotten, the unauthorized, and the incredible, and I want to hear from you in the comments below. We've seen the shaving mirror hack, but what is the single greatest piece of redneck engineering or field improvisation you've ever read about? Was it the hedgerow cutters, the concrete armor? Let's argue it out in the comments. Next time, we are leaving the mud of France for the humid hell of the South Pacific. We're going to look at the P-38 Lightning, a plane that was locking up and killing its own pilots in dives, and the mad scientist major who stripped it naked to make it fight. You do not want to miss